Welcome to a Modern Nonprofit podcast, powered by the Charity CFO, your compass for creative solutions in running your nonprofit. I'm Tosha Anderson, your host and guide through this nonprofit maze. From fundraising to volunteer management, we've got your back. Join us each episode for fresh, game-changing strategies that can make a real impact. Hey, nonprofit friends, welcome back to another episode of a Modern Nonprofit podcast. I'm your host, Tosha Anderson, and today I'm bringing along a fellow nonprofit leader. I love doing this sometimes because it validates the stories and the struggle and the work that you all are doing. And we're going to talk a little bit more about, leadership and how to balance leadership with a big mission. And to have this conversation, I've invited along my new friend, Kathryn Hoffman. Kathryn, you are the CEO of the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, and you lead one of the most impactful environmental organizations in Minnesota. And we are, like I mentioned earlier, excited to talk a little bit more about how you balance a big mission like saving the environment, which is something we should all be thinking about. But you also balance that with actually running an organization and really keeping a human-centered leadership style. This is something we all, I think, can get reminders of, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit. We all have missions and keeping humanity in it. So, Kathryn, thank you for joining us in on this conversation and sharing your words of wisdom in this space.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tosha.
So let's just dive right into it. I know that you use your strategic plan as kind of a framework for a lot of the things that you do. And I love the fact that we're going to talk a little bit about strategic plan because I've been involved so many times about how strategic plans are created and then they kind of sit up on a shelf. And while it's kind of a general vision, it's not used as a framework on how we kind of operate day in and day out. And I'm curious to hear, how do you use your strategic mission, or strategic plan rather, and the mission that your organization has set up to keep your staff laser focused on the work that they're doing? How are you using that day in and day out?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I love this question and I love this topic too. So I'm excited to talk about it. So our mission at MCEA is to use law and science to protect Minnesota's environment and the health of its people. And that law and science part is really key for our mission. In Minnesota, we are blessed with having a lot of environmental organizations that do a lot of types of work. And so when we went through our strategic planning process, one thing we thought about is, what is our strategic advantage as an organization? So what do we do that's different and better than the other groups that makes us special? What's our lane? And a big part of it is being lawyers, right? We have a staff of litigators, of professionals, and other groups will come to us for help on legal advice, litigation, et cetera. And so we think about not just what's important for the environment, we think about that too, but we think about what specifically can lawyers do within that work. So a specific example, here in Minnesota, we recently passed a bill at the legislature to get to 100% clean energy by 2040. And this is a big coalition. We had groups of community organizers and political groups doing lots of different types of work. Our role was to make sure that the legal language matched the intent of the law. It's really easy to manipulate language so that it kind of looks like it's what you want, but it won't actually, be treated that way by like a court or an agency. And so that was our job, was to be the lawyers to say, yep, this is how a court or an agency would look at this law. And so we use that strategic plan to really hone in on, what's our specific job here and where do we add value to this coalition?
That's interesting. What other things in your strategic plan do you feel like help keep you like laser focused? Maybe another example of like, this is in our 5-year plan and we're gonna construct all of our activities or prioritize our activities based on like the list of what's in here.
Sure. So another portion of our strategic plan focuses on how we partner with groups and who are potentially clients and coalitions. And so within environmental justice, there is a kind of unfortunate long-term trend of larger environmental groups, partnering with local groups that work on environmental justice issues, and the larger group comes in and takes up all the space, and maybe it's setting the agenda more than they should, given that there are people in the community who have lived experience of that environmental issue, like maybe a plant that's polluting the neighborhood, for example.
Okay.
And so part of our strategic plan is to actually center the needs and desires of the community and make sure that as lawyers, we are representing those needs. And so every time we take on a new case or a new project, we have really kind of an intake process with a form, and it asks those questions that are laid out in our strategic plan to say, are we approaching this issue in a way that is consistent with our values and how our strategic plan tells us to do that? To make sure that we're serving the needs of the community and not thinking of it as only as lawyers, but as lawyers serving the community, I guess. And of course, we bring the strategic plan back in at every opportunity. So piece of my we just went through our budget process, and there, as the legal organization, a part of our strategic plan prioritizes attracting and retaining very talented people, because we need environmental law experts. And so that means we want to bring in those people. It also means that keeping people for a long time is really good for us because they get that expertise in environmental law time. So when we went through the budget process, one of the things I looked at was our strategic plan. I said, well, look, one of the things we need to do here is invest in our staff, because of course, cost of staff, inflationary pressures, right? Like it's getting more expensive to keep people, and we do want to keep people. So the first priority for that budget process was to invest in our current staff, and that came right out of the plan.
You know, it's interesting for me, like, as I'm hearing you talk about the strategic plan, and in so many ways, I mean, I've worked with, I don't know, probably thousands of nonprofits now in my career, and there's so many organizations that don't have a strategic plan. And in some ways, I understand if they're pivoting or they're re-strategizing or they're kind of going from this direction or another. And I think sometimes that puts organizations very much in a position to, I'll just call it chase the dollars, or like have some mission drift on what it is they're doing. And I can kind of speak from my own experience working with nonprofits and now running a for-profit business that has reached out all the time with opportunities to do work that is adjacent or related to the work that we're doing, but not really in our core sweet spot, and how tempting it is to kind of slowly drift here and there. Have you ever felt like your strategic plan, because it was kind of locked in, it's although, you know, always subject to change, but for the most part, it's usually locked in for a few years. You know, this is what we're going to focus on. This is how we're going to prioritize or base our decisions. Like, these are the principles for which we're going to filter everything through. Do you feel like it's ever been a hindrance to your organization to be able to, have you had to miss any opportunities, or feel like your strategic plan has ever been a hindrance to the work that you're trying to do when presented with a new opportunity?
It's a really good question. You know, we, as an organization, we talk a lot about how we don't chase dollars, and that we really want to keep, you know, the two very closely aligned. And I wouldn't call it a hindrance, but I would say there are things that we say no to that are hard to say no to, because they're tempting, and I guess in a bigger sense, I would say they're important issues, right? So I can think of issues that our staff care about, and we've looked at and said, you know, this is an important issue in the world, and there's really not a role for lawyers here, and we probably can't, you know, do it. And maybe there's money there. Maybe there are foundations that are interested in that issue, and we're not going to pursue those dollars. So, I mean, I would not use the frame of hindrance, so I definitely get where you're coming from. I would say we do have to make hard choices as an organization sometimes. And that, you know, sometimes that means that there's something that a staff person really cares about that we don't do. And
you can't do.
That's a hard choice. But honestly, like, if we were, you know, I have 30 staff, we had 60 staff, we would still have to make those hard choices,
Oh,
right? There's
absolutely.
literally an
Absolutely.
infinite number of issues that we could be working on. And so I
Exactly.
think that's gonna come up regardless.
You said something in the way that I internalized it and processed it was really the need for us to start normalizing the difficult no's, right? And I think for me, especially being the accountant that had to balance the budget for nonprofit organizations, and obviously the idea that more money and more funding would help solve some of those problems, right? But as I've advised so many of my clients on, that sometimes saying no is actually going to put you in a better position than if you were to have said yes. And so I love this concept, at least what I'm thinking about in my mind as you're saying this, like, let's just start normalizing saying no a little bit more potentially for your organization, if as kind of as it relates to this conversation, it's really outside of our initial plan or kind of our priority areas, and that is such a difficult position to be in, so I can empathize with that.
Oh, for sure.
So
And Tasha, sorry, I can just
no,
interject
go
there.
ahead.
Completely agree. And I mean, you started this conversation with this idea of being human-centered. And I
Mm-hmm.
mean, part of the challenge of being in a nonprofit is there is that infinite amount of work. And I think as
Mm-hmm.
nonprofit employees, we often tell ourselves the story of, if I just work one more hour, I can make a little bit more
Mm-hmm.
good happen in the world. And that way lies, burnout and madness. And so this
Mm-hmm.
idea of normalizing saying no, which is, I love the way you put that, I think is also very important to the longevity of our employees. And it's going to make
Yeah.
us more effective in the long term because we will be able to do this a lot longer because we're not burning ourselves out.
I mean, that's a whole nother episode I feel like we can have conversations around. And I talk often about this with my team, and certainly I'm not saving the environment. Nothing that serious. And as I tell my team, like, look, we're accountants, we're not saving lives. We're not, as much as people like to treat it that way sometimes, we're not actually saving lives with our reconciliation. So let's kind of keep that in perspective. And you said something with like the normalizing the discomfort of saying no. I wrote this down for later, especially when it comes to funding or growth opportunity, just despite, in the words you use, having an infinite need for the work that you do. It's never going to be done. Like, I mean, maybe that'd be great. I mean, that's what the nonprofit world says.
It
Like,
would
it
be
would be
great.
amazing if there was no need for our work. But the reality is, at least in our lifetime, it's probably never going to end. And so having your team see, and I've had this experience, like having your team see you as the leader of an organization saying no because you are prioritizing their health and well-being. It's like, look, we can't save everybody, we can't save everything. We're saying no because this is what's right for our team and the sustainability of what we're trying to do. Because if we try to save everybody now and we try to do everything now, there's not going to be much left for us. We'll have a bigger impact in the short run, but we may like fail to exist in the long run, and that's not gonna help the greater good. So I can
Right.
empathize with that a lot. So speaking of the work that you do and what a big task it is, and the mission of environmental, all the environmental work that you're doing, some of this is probably a little difficult to measure. So how do you measure the impact of the work that you do?
Yeah, I mean, as an environmental organization, we can look at some measurable outcomes, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
if there is less pollution, if a river is cleaner or the air is
Yeah.
clearer, that's a measurable outcome, and we do use those. We look at
Mm-hmm.
trends, for example, in greenhouse gases emitted from various sectors in Minnesota to decide where we've had success. For example, in the
Mm-hmm.
electricity sector, we've had quite a bit of success pushing utilities to close coal plants to reduce greenhouse gases there. And where we
Mm,
need to put our efforts, the agricultural sector in Minnesota continues to grow in terms of its greenhouse gas emissions. So there's those sort of objective measurements, but that's definitely not all we use. We
right.
also think about our impact on movements and on people. So part of our strategic plan is, I mentioned about partnerships. We think about partnering in a way that makes our partners stronger and lifts them up. and makes our coalitions more equitable. And so we'll often ask at the end of a project as part of the evaluation process, did we empower our partners here? Was there an outcome that created strength for the next fight? So one example is an oil pipeline that was proposed to go through Minnesota, Line 3. Some of your listeners probably heard of it. It got quite a bit of national attention after Dakota Access. And we did not win that fight. So we had lawsuits and conversations at the Public Utilities Commission, and ultimately it was approved. And so by that measure, we lost. But we looked at another metric as well, which is what was the coalition outcome here? And what we found was that the groups, there were much stronger relationships between the groups. There were activists there were people who were activated who hadn't been before. And that, a fight like this is never done. There will be opportunities to, for example, close this pipeline before the end of its expected life because we don't need this oil and we don't want it. And as those fights go forward, we will have a more powerful coalition in order to engage there. And so we also look at that question of what was the outcome in terms of the overall movement and our partners, and are we more ready for our next opportunity?
I love that. How often does your leadership look at these sort of metrics? Because I get asked all the time from clients, what metrics, KPIs, are you looking at or that you've seen with other organizations? And I try to tell people, look, there's no standard for every organization should have these KPIs. They're so individualized. But then also for me, the question is not so much which ones you choose, because I think you should choose the ones that are meaningful for you and your organization. But what I've always seen that is a bit of the challenge is how frequently are we reflecting on those and making decisions based on those? So I'm curious, how did your team weave this into, your outcomes and measuring outcomes and things like that? How often is that kind of celebrated or brought up in conversation with your leadership team and figuring out what decisions to make next?
Typically, that's a yearly conversation for us. So each year we'll sort of revisit our goals and our strategic plan and kind of talk about, are we doing the right things? Do we want to shift in some areas? So that's usually a yearly conversation. I think the fights that we're in are very long-term, right?
Oh yeah, multi-year, I'm sure, decades,
exactly.
Maybe even
sometimes multi-decade. I was in Duluth last night, Minnesota, for an event that we had because this is our 50th anniversary year. And so we had a celebration for MCEA and our 50th. But the other thing we were marking is that there's a proposed copper nickel mine up there that we have deep concerns about and have litigated over. And that mine was actually proposed. We put in our first comments 20 years ago in 2004, and we're now still in that fight. And the metric really is, has this mine gone in with the type of proposal that we think is problematic? So we're not anti-mining, but we definitely have specific concerns and ways in which we want this mine to be different and better and meet some more modern standards. And so that one's actually a fairly easy metric of are we still winning this fight? Are we still holding this proposal to the high bar that we think needs to happen? But it is kind of a funny conversation year over year of just, guess we're still winning, still not a problematic mine operation up there. And so when we revisit it year over year, sometimes there's not much change really in the way we're investing or the goals that we're setting. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's a sign of that we're engaged in these fights for many years. And our donors are very helpful in that regard. I mean, they understand that we're not taking on easy fights. We're taking on the hard ones.
Game.
It's a long game. We have actually a very high donor retention rate, which I'm very proud of. And that is because we talk to our donors a lot about the need to invest year over year in order to achieve the kinds of outcomes that we're looking for big, gnarly problems.
Yeah, I would imagine. Thank you for sharing that, because I think that that kind of confirms, the thing that I'm always preaching to our clients. It's like, look, I don't have a 1 page sheet of KPIs that makes sense for everybody, and it goes back to the individualism of each organization. And I suspected, as an environmental organization, that your outcomes would be difficult, because these are not things that change overnight. These are not things that are easy to measure throughout the process. It's like, are we continuing to make headway? Or at least maybe in some cases, the outcome is, have we not fallen back? Have we not seen us in a worse position than we were a year ago and I'm sure at each project that you're working on is all going to be measured differently. So I love that you all talk about it regularly and kind of reflect on it, at least annually, and individualize it for your organization, because that's certainly something that I preach. So
Mm-hmm.
speaking of your team, recently you've gone to a 32-hour work week. I'm really curious to hear how this is going, because you hear a lot of conversation and buzz around a reduced work week, or whether it's like, 4 days, 40 hours, or 32 hours, or whatever. Tell us more about this, going back to the human-centered leadership. Tell me all about it. I'm very curious.
Yeah, so about a year ago, I started reading quite a bit about this movement to a 32-hour work week or a 4-day work week. As you said, there's a variety of ways it gets talked about, because I was very intrigued. And, a lot of folks, not just at MCEA, but, in the world, are experiencing some burnout and challenges with work. Still, I think a lot of effects of the pandemic, and just, the world is too much with us right now in a bunch of ways.
Right.
And so I started looking into this, and I started a conversation with the staff about it and said, I'm interested in this. Do you want to go on this journey with me? And so, everyone else was intrigued as well. And so we formed a staff committee, and I was clear from the get-go, like, my goal by the time we're done here is that we go to a 32-hour work week, and we have the staff buy-in, and we've built it in a way such that we're able to move to those 32 hours without a loss of productivity. Right. Because this is an important part of the way that people talk about it, is that, in fact, a successful transition, people are doing the same amount of work. They're just doing it in a shorter time period because you've put in systems to allow them to do that. So we read some articles, the committee and I read some articles together. We really focused on the work of the nonprofit 4-Day Week Global, is I believe the name of the group. They've done studies all over the world. I tried to get into one of their studies, but they didn't have one going in the United States right now. But we were able to take a lot of cues from them and look at, okay, what are the internal processes that we need to streamline? What are the barriers here? And so people said, well, we have a lot of meetings, right? Which is common. And we're not sure we have enough unbroken focus time to do the work that we want. It's very common, I think, for people in a modern workplace to, for example, log on early and get, a couple hours of focus work done before 8 or 9 a.m. and their meetings start.
All the distractions happen.
Exactly. You don't have emails pinging you or Slack notifications or, whatever systems you use pinging you on a regular basis. So they said, well, we need to have that time within the 32 hours, not outside of it, because that's how we're, doing it now.
Sure.
And so we had each project team talk about their meeting cadence. We had everybody look at their check-ins with their supervisors, because those tend to take up, do you need these weekly, or can you do these in a different way or less? And we also really shifted our internal communication strategies. So one of the challenges to this is that people are, particularly when they're working remotely, it's become super common for people to need to show or feel like they need to show that they're working by being visible online, right? If I respond to my email really fast, everybody knows I'm working. If I'm on Slack notifications all day, everybody knows that I'm working. And this is pseudo productivity, right? This is not actual productivity. activity.
Right. They
But
could
your
be
boss knows
responding like, yeah, anywhere. Yeah. It doesn't mean you're working necessarily, but the perception is there. Yeah.
the perception, right? Exactly. And the inverse is true too. Like if somebody didn't respond to their emails for a couple of days, especially if it was a fully remote environment, I think people would start saying, well, is that person working? What are they doing?
Right. Exactly.
And so we wanted to shift those expectations. And so we talked about Slack and email as being asynchronous forms of communication, meaning you don't have to be on it all the time. And if I send an email to a staff, I only reasonably expect that they respond within 48 hours.
Mm,
And if it's something I need right now, I will pick up the phone or I will text. And so
mm,
taking certain types of communications and leaving them in Slack and email, and taking other types to like, yeah, I
mm.
need this today. I'm going to call you or I'm going to text
Right.
you, to
Interesting.
create space for people to feel like, yep, I don't have to check my email or my Slack. I mean, there's these studies that show people check their email and Slack every 6 minutes. Uh,
Yes, I believe it.
it's
I believe
super
it. I
intense.
call it
And
like
so,
I've described to my team, it's like feeding the seagulls. Like once you start like hyper responding and then, people get used to that and then it never ends. It just keeps growing and growing and growing. And then you're surrounded by hungry seagulls. It's like, make it stop. So
exactly. And
yes,
then, and
I
once you
believe
get into
that.
that cycle, everybody else is waiting to, move their work forward on that email. And so then they're checking all the
Mm-hmm.
time. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, that's
Um,
interesting. I like how you created different systems of like this is day to day. Let me back up. I think the challenge in the workplace is that there's this perception that anytime you ask for something, the assumption is it's urgent, maybe. I don't know. Maybe that's just some of the cultures I worked with. And so they treat every request and message. And for my team, it's whether it's internally or from one of our clients, oh my gosh, I have to do this right now. And so if they're checking their email constantly, then they're constantly pulled off task. When in reality, how do you differentiate between the truly urgent request and the requests that are just, hey, I'm throwing this in your inbox because I'm trying to make some headway on a task that I'm working on and we're collaborating or whatever. So I love that you have like the phone system, the old trusty phone, or texting versus, Slack or email is just really our way of, conversing. So I love that.
Yeah. So we've shifted those internal processes. We also allowed staff to opt in to the 32-hour work week. So there's only a couple, but there are some people who decided they don't want to opt in because it does
Mm-hmm.
require a little extra work and focus to think about how am I going to do this work in less time.
Mm-hmm.
And what I don't know that this would happen at MCEA, but there are other workplaces that have tried this and it didn't work. And one way it doesn't work is if you have employees who who haven't bought into the idea and have said, look, a work week is 40 hours or 50 hours or 60 hours, and that's what I'm going to work. And then I'm going to start resenting the people that are only working, 32 or 36.
Mm-hmm.
And so this
Mm-hmm.
opt-in allows people to say, you know what, that's not for me, and avoids that. I don't know if it fully avoids it, but it's been successful
Right.
for us. Avoids a little bit of that resentment. And I don't even know, I think most people don't even know which of their employees or which of their coworkers have opted in and have not.
Right.
And in part because we've created these things we call core working hours, which is
Mm-hmm.
everybody has to be available between 10 and 3, Monday through
Right.
Thursday, to each other for internal meetings, so that to
Mm-hmm.
make sure that we're all have enough overlap that we can collaborate and move our work
Right.
forward the way that we need to. And staff, so that's 20 hours, if you count it out, right? And so if you were opting in, that's another 12 hours you have to work. It's more if you didn't opt in. And how you want to do that is up to you, right? If you're an early
Right.
riser, you want to work
Right.
7 to
Right.
3, cool. You want to work Fridays, you want to work Sundays, I don't care. That doesn't matter.
Right.
That's to you. It's just that 10 to 3. So we all kind of experience each other the same way as coworkers within those core working hours, regardless of how much people are working outside of that.
So I have to ask this because I get people ask me all the time internally, my team, what about 32-hour work weeks? That's certainly been brought up internally. And I know that I'm not alone in that. And I'm sure a lot of nonprofits too struggle with this, when you are dealing with when your core operations, what you do is interacting with people and responding to the needs that they have that aren't falling within, Monday through Thursday, for example. How do you have that issue at your organization? So, for example, I have clients, over 200 clients I work with all the time. I don't even know which ones may or may not be on some sort of shortened work schedule, but there might be an urgent request on Friday because that's what came up for them because their team's working and they were made aware of this urgent thing. And then if we're closed on Friday, how will that fall short on kind of meeting their service expectations or the needs that they have? And so I'm thinking about that from my own personal perspective, but I'm also thinking about other organizations that are nonprofits that are serving. I'm thinking about obviously education centers or drop-in centers, all of these things that are maybe more on the social service side. And I get that maybe it just doesn't work for some businesses, but I always like to believe that if there's a will, there's a way as well. So like what would have to be true in order to make this work? And so I didn't know if you all are dealing with urgent things that come through that, hey, this case had a major break and it happens to be on Friday. It's like everything's going to happen on Friday afternoon, it feels like Friday morning. So how do you all navigate that? Or is that not as much relevant to you all can better maybe manage and individualize your own workload? Is that an issue for you? And how do you overcome it if it was?
For sure, it's an issue. And this was this was something we talked about a lot as a staff and came up quite a bit in the conversations as we launched into this 32-hour work week. And so one thing to know is that we're not closed on Friday, and we don't talk about it that way. We do have staff that work on Friday, and the goal of those core working hours of Monday through Thursday is actually that with those extra 12 hours, you can put the time in on Friday. So, oftentimes we'll know there's a court hearing on Friday. There's going to be a press release. There's going to be a court decision that comes down, and we have to talk to people. I've got something, big going with clients, and that means I'm going to have to be available on Friday as well because we've got this, thing that's happening that needs ongoing back and forth while we get to a decision. Often folks will have external meetings on Friday. And so the goal of those core working hours is to give that flexibility so that staff who need to work on Fridays will work on Fridays. And it's not, that's not a problem. No one is forced to. And if you take a 3-day weekend and you sort of plan that out and make that work for yourself, you don't have to take a vacation day is the way the policy works. But definitely people work on Fridays. I mean, I'm talking to you on Fridays.
Right.
And
okay,
so
that makes sense.
People do it, but within that flexibility. And of course, most of us are salaried employees. So just like a 40-hour work week now for lots of folks comes out to be 45 or 50, or in some cases more. 32-hour work week doesn't actually mean for salary employees 32 hours every week.
It's always 32, obviously. Yeah, you could have
that's
a big
sort of
case
a
or something going on. Yeah,
it's common that people will work 36, and it definitely happens that people work more. But on the whole, the goal is that 32 hours. We are 4 months into this experiment. So we started this in March, and we're doing an assessment in September to see how this is going. My informal sort of conversations and data gathering suggests that people are definitely, some folks are able to achieve 32 hours. There's a lot more and probably closer to the 36-hour range, but that they love that flexibility of having a lot more ability to choose when and where they work outside of those core working hours.
So I know I could talk about this all day, and I know we're kind of already running out of time. So I want to kind of wrap up this conversation with this. We started this with kind of the human-centered leadership, and I'm curious for people that are, some of the things that you said are resonating with them. Like, our team is very valuable. There's a lot, especially value in institutional knowledge and retaining the same team members for a long period of time. How do we minimize burnout? How do we keep people engaged, at the place, that you're leading? And anybody that's kind of struggling with something similar, like, oh, wow, that really resonates, because that is true also for my organization. If they want to start thinking about this idea of like human-centered leadership, or some of the things that you've talked about either today or that you've done, maybe you haven't talked about, where was like the starting point, or where would you advise, like, look, if you really want to get into this human-centered leadership, this is where I started this conversation. Obviously, the most recent, which we didn't get into it, is like a hybrid workspace. You just went to a 32-hour work week, say no to things. Are these things you started with, or is there a chapter that we haven't read before now? Like, where did you kind of start with these conversations internally?
The place where I started and I started engaging the staff was actually a book called Deep Work by Cal Newport.
I love that book. Yes.
Yes. And this idea, I think it was just, the pandemic was so hard on everybody, and news is constantly coming in, and this question of how do we create the space for people to really focus? And so I read the book, and it was very compelling to me, this idea of sort of the modern knowledge worker needing time to really focus on their work, distraction-free for longer periods of time. And that is the value that I am frankly paying my employees for, right? Is their amazing.
Right.
And if they are bouncing around all day and feeling like they need to do that as in response to various things, I'm not getting the full value of my employees. And so that was actually the starting point. And from there flowed a lot of these ideas of our internal communications policy and the 32-hour work week, and really thinking about how do I get people to really come up with the creative and cool ideas that I know that they can, and create the space for that.
I love that. I've also read that book a long time ago, and I've also read books like 4-Hour Work Week and all these different books that suggest even increasing productivity and impact while lessening the actual work. And I think as a leader, I've had to take an honest look at myself and how I interact with my team and expectations of what I've had. And what do I mean by that? I mean about sending emails all the time. In fact, we can talk offline about this, but I banned internal emails a long time ago, because then you have all these conversations going in all these different channels. So we use Slack only internally for internal communication, so people understand that that's all internal. I schedule them during like core working hours. I'm not sending emails at 7:00 or Slack messages at 7:00, because people have this perception then that they have to, reach out to me. I'm not calling their personal phones all the time on times that are off. So I'm trying to be really intentional about how I initiate those conversations or have requests or schedule meetings. Like, are you scheduling unnecessary? Listen, the nonprofit world, I know because I lived it for a long time, they like their meetings. I've never ever seen, because I went from like public accounting where everything's about the billable hour, so you better be working on client work, and straight into the nonprofit industry. I said, how am I supposed to get work done around here? I'm in meeting after meeting after meeting after, it's insane. So anyway, I think we as leaders can just have honest conversations with ourselves on how can we create more space for that deep work that you talked about. It's a great book. If you haven't read it, I suggest anyone do. And then that is at least, I think, a great starting point, like you said, to start having an honest conversation and do an inventory about where are we pulling our team members in these different directions, or where are we setting communication expectations that are constantly putting them in a distraction mode. And I couldn't even begin to gauge how much time my team saves by not having an email system where you have carbon copy filtering through all of the unnecessary emails. It's like, if it's all messages are direct, like with using Slack, like you're not on that message if you're not a need to know, really, is how we operate. And so just little tweaks like that have, I think, a big impact. So I love that. And then of course, I love that you've evolved that into evaluating how do we work in a hybrid space? How do we reduce our work hours as a whole on average? How do we just eliminate any barriers for productivity that are just simple fixes, or maybe not so simple, but they're manageable fixes. So thank you for sharing all of this. And I think it's something that all leaders, whether it's a nonprofit or for-profit, new leaders, seasoned leaders, should be kind of evaluating on some sort of semi-periodic basis, just to see how can we do things differently now. So thank you for all of that.
Yeah.
And Kathryn, if people wanted to either just follow along with the work that you're doing or your leadership, what is the best way for people to hear a little bit more about the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, or just kind of connect with you just from a peer-to-peer perspective? What's the best way to follow along?
Well, definitely people should feel free to reach out and connect with me or follow me on LinkedIn.
Okay.
That would be great. Our website is mncenter.org. As part of our 50th, we're trying to reach a lot more people. That's one of our
Okay.
goals. So definitely
Okay.
feel free to sign up for our email list. And we'll
Okay.
get a monthly email that talks about our work. And then we're available on various social platforms,
Platforms.
MCEA 1974.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for joining us. And for those that are listening, if you found this information or this conversation insightful or informative, please do me a favor, engage with it in some way. You all know how this works. I'm doing my shameless plug now. Interact with it in some way because that's how the meta world works. The more that you engage with this content, the more other leaders like yourself will be able to find content like this and help them make their organization run just a little bit easier in the short and the long term. Thank you all so much. We'll see you next time. Bye now.
That's all we have for you today. Once again, I'm Tosha Anderson with the Charity CFO, and this is a Modern Nonprofit Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to a Modern Nonprofit Podcast on all major streaming platforms so you will stay notified for when the latest episode drops, which will help you stay in the know about anything nonprofit related. Also, join our community on Facebook by searching for a Modern Nonprofit Podcast and follow us on all of our social media accounts. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.